So welcome to our Be Well webinar. Today we'll be thinking about how to respond to the Be Well reports, that online report that you've received. So in terms of our agenda today, I'm going to introduce a bit of context, how this connects with some resources that we've recently published. I'm going to talk about participation and engagement at the start, but also we'll be thinking about that as we go through the session and encouraging you to think about that as you plan your response. I'll then do an overview of the approach that we're suggesting in terms of responding to the data. And then we'll think about some of the steps within that approach. So we'll think about identifying key issues, considering your context. Every school's different and the context is incredibly important when thinking about what the data's saying and how to respond to it. So thinking about reviewing your current position, where are you now, where to go next, leading into planning for improvement and thinking about how the impact of those improvements are going to be monitored. And then I'll take you through some of the further support that is on offer. As we go through it, I'll be showing you some resources. All of the resources that I'll show you are available on the Be Well website. We may be adding more resources as we go, but this core set are there. I'm going to show you some of them. They're screenshotted, they're quite small, you won't be able to see the detail on them, but they're there illustrative and I will talk to you about them. And then I would encourage you to go onto the Be Well website, find those resources and have a look for yourself. As I share the resources with you, they're there to help. So you might want to adapt them and use them in the way that works for you. I'll talk about that as we go along. So hopefully that's what you were expecting. And so I will crack on. So this webinar today links directly to a set of resources that we published last week. The Be Well responding to your report. So what that is there's a kind of overview resource that explains the process, and it's very similar to what you'll see on screen today. And then sitting behind that, there are various different resources that we think will be useful for you in responding to this. Very much for you to use in the way that works for you. But with the intention that it's helping you to move from hearing and understanding what pupils have said to deciding how to act in response. So I'll take you through the steps as we would see them. We know that all schools have improvement processes in place. You have improvement plans, you have ways that you do things in your school or across your group of schools. And what we want is for this to complement and inform that. It's not there to replace it. Use it in the way that works best with your kind of cycle of school improvement planning. Because what we know is that when children and young people's well-being is at the heart of what a school does and isn't a bolt-on, is where it really makes the difference. So we would really encourage you to embed some of the things we're suggesting into your current practice. So today I'll be introducing the resource and explaining the process that sits around it and introducing you to some of the resources. Okay, throughout the resource and throughout what I'll be talking about today, very much an emphasis on participation and engagement, particularly of young people, but also young people and their families and other members of the community. But really ensuring that young people are at the heart of Be Well has been important to us in the development of the Be Well programme and continues to be important as we go through. And we really want to encourage you to engage young people in the process that I'm going to talk through with you today. To support with that, on many of the slides that I'll show you today, but also in the resource when you go onto it on the website, you'll see some yellow boxes and they give ideas for how you might want to engage the wider school community. So that's going all the way through and they're there to help. It is not, it can never be comprehensive. You know the young people in your school. You know the systems and structures you have in place for engaging young people, what opportunities are there, and how your school works. So be creative, do what's going to work for you. These are very much just ideas. And we would really ask that if you do have some good ideas as to how to do it, we'd like to hear about it, because we're able through our communications to share examples of good practice with other schools, and it may be that you've developed a really creative response that others would want to hear about. And that's very much about building the community around Be Well of everyone working together. I'm going to also draw your attention to a resource that there is a link there, and you'll get the slides afterwards. It's also on the website, of the London model of participation. Time doesn't permit for me to go into that in a huge amount of detail, but I wanted to flag that it's there. And that's a really useful model for how to think about how young people should be involved in the kind of activity that we're talking about today. And it draws on the rights of the child and the kind of right for involvement. Have a look at it. It's being widely used nationally, possibly beyond nationally. I'm certainly aware of many areas around the country that are using it. And there's been a real push in Greater Manchester to adopt the model. So drawing your attention to it now, have a look at it and see how it fits in with the kind of work and activity that you've either got going on already or that you might be planning in response to your report. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be taking you through today. These are the kind of 4 main steps that we'll be looking at. So first of all, thinking about what does your report say, thinking about some key ways to identify what the key findings are. That's very much focused on what's in the report. What does the data say? We know that data all comes from a particular context. So what we then encourage you to do is what might be contributing to these findings. That's thinking about your context. So what are you doing that's ensuring the things that are going well? What might be contributing in terms of some of those factors that you as a school might not have huge amounts of control over? Who are the other players within that? So thinking about what might be contributing to it, and then also what have you already got in place? So what's your current position? So what's been going well, what's been really firmly embedded, and then thinking about where the gaps might be, so to kind of feed into how you're going to respond. So that's really the planning for improvement. And linked to the planning for improvement, I'm going to talk to you about how you might plan to monitor and evaluate that improvement as you go. There's an emphasis within Be Well that we believe that you should be looking for evidence that that what you're doing is making a difference, and gathering that evidence. I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. So important to plan what evidence you need to be gathering to see that you're making the difference that you want to do. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the first of those 4 headings. So what does the report say? And what we've just identified here is identifying key findings. So what are the areas of relative strength for pupils in your school? I think often when you a data set is shared with you, you've got a load of charts, and the strengths are sometimes the things that people spend less time on. I think it's really important that you do spend the time looking at, okay, what's going well, because there's lots that can be learnt about the things that are going well. Actually, if something's a strength, why is it a strength? What have you got in place that has made that be a strength? And also thinking about areas of relative strength that can actually be, they're real assets for the children and young people, and it may be that building on those strengths can actually lead to improvements in other areas. So very much focusing on those. When we're talking about Be Well, we use the LAC acronym, Listen, Act, Celebrate. Those strengths are what you want to celebrate, the things that have been going really, really well for your school, where you're really making a difference to children and young people. But what we also want to do is see if there are areas that are concerning. Now, within the report, you've got your Be Well summary, has a kind of traffic light. I'll show you that on the next slide that you might have looked at. That's a really simple way at a glance of seeing, you know, the things that are red are the things that might be of concern. Maybe within your school, you've actually got lots of things that on that RAG rating are amber. So it might be thinking, okay, what do we need to prioritise within these amber areas, because there aren't any things that are showing up as red. So thinking about that and thinking about what your report says. I think obviously looking at a whole school or whole year group level, but then, you know, drilling down into the data. And that's one of the great things about your Be Well data dashboard, is that you can filter it by different groups. You could look at children with special educational needs. You could look at how your genders compare. It may be that there are some particular challenges or particular strengths for girls, for boys, all sorts of things that you can have a look at. So look at the overall, but then drill down into what's going on for those particular groups that come underneath it. And as you're doing it, I think always useful to think, okay, before they did this survey, what would you have thought was happening? So does the data actually reinforce what you felt you knew about the children and young people in your school? Does it look pretty much as you would have expected it to? Or are there things in there that are actually a bit surprising, that you may be surprised in a positive way, that actually something that you felt was more of a concern, actually it would appear children and young people are doing better than you might have imagined? Or that there are surprises that an area where it hadn't particularly been a priority in your school, not something you were concerned about, actually the data would suggest that this is more of a concern than it might be. There are also, I think, in terms of surprises, thinking about, okay, what sits behind that surprise? What why is it a surprise? What do I need to dig a bit deeper to find out a little bit more about it? And so lots of work that can go on around that to really understand what's happening. So in terms of what we would encourage you to do is obviously engage the staff team with the report. This is not a report that will sit in a head teacher's office. We would really encourage you to share it with staff. Obviously it's big, there's a lot of data there. So it may be that you have a representation of staff that look at the whole thing, or it may be that you share the summary report with a wider group of staff. You know what works for you. The summary report is designed to be really easy to understand, so quite accessible. So that would be appropriate to use perhaps with your school council or a wellbeing team. So getting some young people involved at this point, because everybody interprets a report in a different way. Some people might see one thing as being an issue, whereas actually for somebody else, that might be a different thing, might be the thing that stands out. And really getting those views of children and young people at this stage can be really, really helpful. It may be that you can then pull out some key findings that could be shared with a wider group of young people. So, using tutor time, I'm going to show you a resource over the page that could be helpful in doing that. So thinking about how you can get children and young people engaged right from the point of identifying what the key findings are, so that they're a part of the thinking around the prioritisation process. So a couple of resources here that might be helpful. Again, these are on the website. So on the left, you can just see a screen grab from the summary report. In this one, there's lots of reds and some ambers, so probably the ambers are the things that are going better for this particular group. But these are reasonably easy to understand, could certainly be shared with school council. They could certainly be shared with staff and might have a view as to what these things might mean. So useful as a kind of at a glance view of how things are going. The one on the right is a resource that's designed for sharing with children and young people. So you can see that you may, and this could come out of that process of discussion with staff and with perhaps a smaller group of young people, that gives you something to then go back to young people and say, okay, you all did this survey, thanks, that was brilliant, we found out so much about you. And perhaps highlighting a couple of things that seem to be of concern and that you've identified as a priority. And then you can use the amber to say, actually, these are ones that doesn't seem to be going so well. I might want to understand it a little bit better. So some things that might need a bit more digging. And then obviously the green is an opportunity to really celebrate things that are going well and identifying those strengths and reporting those back to children and young people. So you could relatively easily populate this. It's an editable resource. Populate that, and perhaps use that as a stimulus for discussions in form periods and those kind of things. So already thinking about how young people can be involved, getting their view on what you chose as the priorities, really important input from young people on those ones that it's less clear what the issues are and that might need a bit more unpicking. It may well be that you say to the children and young people, this seemed to be something that didn't look like it was going that well, tell us more, and getting the response that way. Okay, so that's the kind of first step. So it's really thinking, what does the data say, and unpicking that a bit more. But what is so important, and this is the bit that a report can never identify what the context is. So really reflecting on what that data says, the things that seem to be going well, things that seem to not be going so well, and thinking about what the contributory factors might be to that. What's going on within your context that might have affected how the results work. So it may be some of the things that are listed there, things going on in school, but also could be home, community, wider environment. Have a think about those. Sometimes you know that there were certain things going on at the time that the survey was completed. Are those things still the case? Might some things have changed already? And we know the survey was done at a time when, because of COVID, some schools were having to close and some young people were being educated at home. And so it wasn't the most settled periods in children and young people's lives. Perhaps things are feeling a bit more settled now. So thinking about what those specific factors are. There may have been particular events or incidents that were happening within your school at that time. You know those things. And what you also know is what are the positive factors that might help and might support, that might be protective of pupils, and really thinking how you can bolster those and use them as a way of building up the support that sits around you. So thinking about how the positive factors interplay with some of the more challenging things that might need to be addressed. I think, again, thinking participation, engagement, sometimes those contextual factors can affect quite a small group of children and young people, and it may be worth pulling in a wider staff team to understand what was going on for those particular groups of young people at that particular time. Again, following on from what I just said previously, and again, creating those opportunities for students to reflect on those findings and consider what might be influencing the current situation. So thinking back to the traffic light that I just shared with you, perhaps that kind of amber, what's going on here? What do we need to know a bit more about? Why might this be the case? And talking to young people and getting their contribution to that. And there's some discussion questions that might be helpful in terms of using that in a staff meeting or with a group of young people. Okay, so linked onto the context. So the previous slide is much more about kind of what was going on, but also thinking about what's already in place. Different schools we know have different types and provisions, different extent. We know that schools have limited resources, well, limited resources full stop, but limited resources to focus on well-being. Thinking about how those resources are currently being used. Thinking about how well it's working, and I think this is something that, and when I speak in a couple of minutes about how you might want to plan to monitor and evaluate the impact, that might give you some ideas as to how to understand how things are working and how your practices around that could be developing, because we know that it's quite hard to know the difference things are making. But we do know that schools routinely collect feedback from students on things that they've been involved in, or more generally. So use that as part of your review of your current position. Have you got any feedback from students? Have you got feedback from families? And thinking about what that tells you and helping to build a really clear view of what your current position is. It may be you need to gather some more feedback. Might be that you need to gather some specific feedback about specific areas of provision, and you might think about how to do that. Doesn't have to be a huge exercise. Actually, a few conversations with some key people can be sufficient. And then thinking around there's obviously what you know and what's happening in school, but also thinking about who else has a role in supporting your students. Students spend a lot of time at school, but they don't spend all of their time at school. For some of your young people, they'll be accessing targeted and specialist support within school, but they might also be accessing targeted and specialist support outside of school. So there are other people with a role in supporting students. As well as the kind of more formal supportive roles, there are also those other organisations that will be within your community that children and young people might access. So they might be regularly visiting their local mosque, or they might be accessing a youth group, or you know what's going on in your local area. There are lots of people out there who will be working with and have contact with the young people in your school that either do currently have a role in supporting your students or potentially could have a larger role in supporting students and could be part of the solutions that you're taking forward. I'm going to show you a little exercise on the next page about that. As I say, how students, families and staff feel about current provision. What do you know? What feedback have you had? What do students, families and staff think of the quality? Do they think it makes a difference? Are children and young people really keen to attend when there's additional support and intervention, or are they less keen to be involved, and why might that be? Do families think that the offer that your school provides, be that what you offer directly or what you're able to signpost to, how do families feel about that? And does staff feel that there is the right levels of support for children and young people? So lots of people with a view there. I'm going to take you on to the next page so we can just have a look at a couple of resources that we've developed that can help with that. So the first one is that we've got a self-review template. Again, this is just a way of focusing in on what's currently in place. So thinking about, and we've divided it in a specific way. So we've thought about whole school elements, that kind of whole school approach, the school, the culture, those whole school systems that are there that we know are absolutely key in terms of supporting children and young people's mental health and well-being. So thinking about the Public Health England produced resources on whole school approaches quite a few years ago now. There's a building evidence base that these make a difference. So thinking what they are, what are the whole school elements that are there, what are the systems and structures that are in place, and then focusing into the universal support. So what we mean by universal support is the provision that's there for everyone. So this could be about your pastoral care, but it could also be around things that are integrated perhaps into your PSHE curriculum, careers education, those kind of things that all students at some point during their school life can have access to. And then focusing in a bit more about, actually there might be some more targeted support, some individuals or perhaps some groups that have more higher levels of need, and that might be kind of targeted prevention work. So probably maybe emerging needs or things that feel reasonably manageable within a school context. But you can see that there are groups that need some additional support. So what have you got currently in place there? And then that more specialist support for children and young people with more complex needs. And that may be about what you provide as a school, but probably within this area is about who you refer to and what those systems and structures are to ensure that the journey from an identified need to the right kind of support is efficient, and children and young people are falling through the gaps at that point. So thinking about it in those kind of levels can be really helpful in terms of planning your response. That some of this is actually about support for a very small number of young people, a relatively small number of young people, and that would be more the kind of interventions. Whereas the whole school elements are really about school culture and systems. So thinking about it on those different levels can be really, really helpful. And not just thinking about what's there, but thinking about how it's going and what the evidence of impact is. Is it actually making a difference? Are you seeing change in the young people that you work with? Or are you actually seeing, you know what, there are some gaps here, and they may start to become evident. And it may be that you can see a correlation between the gaps in support and some of the things that your report was saying to you. So thinking about how they might work. The other resource that you can see now is, we called it a mapping bullseye. This is really just a way of thinking about all of the people who may be, people and organisations that may be part of the support for children and young people and their families. And so thinking about the support that is in school, who are those people, what is it? And they would be likely to be the things that have come up on the self-review, but it may be key people within the school. It may be that you have targeted counsellors that come in X number of times a week. So things that are happening within your school. So you could have somebody from an organisation like Place to Be or someone that is coming in. So what's there in your school? But then thinking outside of that is actually what's around in your community. So where are young people going? What kind of organisations are they involved in? Is there a, local sports clubs, those kind of activities that young people can engage with, community centres, church groups. There are lots and lots of people who have contact with the young people in your school. So starting to map who those people are can be then really helpful in terms of working as a community, in terms of building a response. So what we would really encourage you to do there is be as specific as possible. So, for example, when you're talking about services, so they're the wider services that your school can access or signpost to, try, if you can, to not just put, oh, actually services, there's CAMS. It's like, actually, which is our CAMS? Who's our key contact person in CAMS? How might we engage them in the process that we're going through as a school? Because these are all people that can be part of the solutions going forward, but also might have some views on some of the issues that they've identified. So thinking about who those people are can be really, really helpful. It can also be a useful way of highlighting where actually perhaps you haven't got the contacts into your local community or into some of the services. So it can actually be, do we need to make some new contacts? Do we need to build a stronger network and join together some of these people that might be able to be part of our response? Also involve young people in the mapping. They know where they go, they know who they spend time with, they know who they would be seeking support from, they know who they may have received support from. As a school, you have a really good view of what your children and people are doing and the kind of services they're accessing, but there'll always be something that you don't know about but a young person will be able to tell you about. And so involve young people there and see what they can add to that. Okay, so what we're thinking about now is, so we've looked at the data, we've looked at many contextual factors and all the things that sit around that data, the things that are happening in your school, the people who are sitting around your school. So you've got a really clear picture of what's happening. So then it's thinking about how you're going to actually respond, planning for action. Thinking about, okay, so this is the problem, these are the gaps that we can see, this is something we need to do something about them. So scanning the horizon, what are the options, what could we do? And then once you've thought about what could you do, actually thinking how are you going to make an informed choice about that. So there's a huge range of possibilities in terms of supporting children and young people's well-being. Why might you choose one option over another? You might want to consider, what's the evidence base that sits behind it? How effective is it? What evidence is that it's going to be right for you? It may be based on experience and recommendation. It may be that at this point it's thinking, okay, what do my colleagues in other schools do? What other options have they explored? How have they found them? How's that going to work? Maybe no one's got an answer, and that's when it might be worth getting together with a group of schools and going, let's work through this together. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that at the end. Maybe that there are particular priority areas that actually there's quite an established evidence base for what happens. The evidence base for support around well-being is developing, but is stronger in some areas than in others. And there are gaps in the research, but there are definitely some areas where there is evidence that these types of activities work. So think about that. Built into this kind of planning process is actually you're planning your response, likely to be led by senior staff within school, but who else needs to be involved in discussing that response? And that's where your bullseye from the previous slide can come in really helpful, come in really handy. Actually, do we need to talk to our parent forum about this? Do we need to engage with the local statutory service providers or the voluntary sector providers that are in our area to see actually where they might be able to help in terms of response. They might have ideas as to what you can do. They may be able to do some specific work within your school. There are lots of people out there who potentially can help, and by discussing your response with them, that can bring them in, and they can be part of the journey that you're on. I think the fourth point here, incorporating it into school or college policies and improvement plans. I think that goes back to something that I said at the start. We know if change is really embedded, that's when it sticks. It doesn't feel like it's not a bolt-on. It's actually integral to what we do, and the way to make that happen is ensuring that it's linked into the policies that you have in place, that it's part of the improvement. It links into your improvement plan, and all of those kind of indicators, which I'm going to show you a slide in a sec, are there, and it's tight, and you know when it's going to be reviewed, and you know how you're going to monitor it, which is the final point. How will you monitor the success of any new approaches? So the key questions are there. I'm going to share a couple of resources with you for this part of it. So the first one, and again, this is pretty standard kind of action planning template. Identify what your priority area is. We would say don't choose too many. You know, prioritizing means picking the things that you're going to work on. And I think there's a huge amount of data in your report. Really focus in on what really feels like it needs to be the priority now. And those domains and drivers that are within the questionnaire could be helpful in terms of naming those priority areas. This is what we really want to focus on. And then thinking, okay, actually, what do we want to be better? What do we want to change? What does success look like? So you know what you're focusing on. This is what we want to have at the end of, you know, the time span of this. And then reasonably standard kind of action planning things there. We put some guidance underneath which relates specifically to mental health and well-being. So thinking about what needs to happen, and going back to the looking at your current provision, thinking what needs to happen at whole school level, your whole school approach response, but also looking at targeted intervention and universal support. So thinking at the different levels what needs to happen that will contribute to change in the priority area. Thinking who'll own the action and who could support it. So your stakeholder map, the bullseye that we looked at previously, could be really helpful in terms of that. Who are the people that might be involved? And then thinking, again, with the emphasis on participation, how will young people and their families contribute? So how are you going to engage them with the plans? Standard things, when will it happen? So have some short-term actions and some kind of quick wins as well as the longer-term actions. Thinking about resourcing, and then thinking about monitoring and measuring impact and how you will evaluate success. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more on the next slide about ways of monitoring and measuring impact. Okay, so within the resources, we've got some monitoring interventions guidance. It's quite a high level guidance, but within that there's links to 3 really helpful resources that will take you through this process in more detail than we have time to do today. But in you know, these are resources that are designed with schools in mind, and that you should be able to access reasonably quickly. But one of the things that is really important, and particularly when we're thinking about monitoring interventions, is thinking how can we measure the impact of what they do. And the usual way within research is you measure something at the start and you measure something at the end. So what research would call time 1, time 2, beginning and end, and you see if anything's changed in between. And there are tools to do that. I've got an example here of a questionnaire that you can do. You ask these questions at the beginning, you ask the same questions at the end, and you see if there's been a change as a way of measuring impact. Now that seems a relatively straightforward process. The resources that are on screen now take you through that in a bit more detail, but to do that effectively, it's important to choose the right tool to measure with. And it needs to be fit for purpose for your intervention, which is where the other resource comes in. So this takes you through a kind of a structured way of thinking about your intervention that guides you towards a tool that's going to be effective for measuring that change, so that you can really see that what you're doing is having an impact. So first of all, we would always say describe the intervention, which sounds like an obvious thing, but it's often really pinning it down to actually what is this? What is it meant to change? So what difference do you expect to see of it? And can be trickier than you think. So go through it, have a think about it, and work it through for the interventions that you do. So one of the things sitting behind that is thinking about why do you think it will work. So you've identified that there's a priority area for your school. What you then want to do is find an intervention that actually changes that, makes things better in that area. Does it have an evidence base to show that it does make a change in that area? Is there, what makes you think it's the right thing? So have a think about it, and then think about the delivery. So is it something that's an ongoing intervention? Is it provided for a fixed time? These are the kind of questions to ask. It's all in the resource. Then thinking about who's going to get it. So is it targeted or is it whole school? Thinking about selection and criteria for selection. And then from that, thinking about actually what is the expected change. So do you expect well-being to improve? Do you expect anxiety to be reduced? These are the kind of things that you might want to see. And I would suggest look at some of those domains and drivers that are within the original Be Well questionnaire. Think helpful things in there in terms of things that are measurable and are likely to be things that you are looking to change. And then from that, you can choose a questionnaire that is able to measure that. And these questionnaires are standardized. They've got a basis in research, so we know they measure what they're meant to measure, and we know they've been tested sufficiently that they, if a young person feels the same way, they're likely to respond in the same way. So there's much more detail about kind of theory behind it, particularly in the left hand and the middle resource that you can see at the bottom. That's the toolkit for schools and colleges, and also in the Cork and Anna Freud resource that is in the middle. They talk you through the process of evaluating your interventions and planning to evaluate. The one on the right, the Cork website, which is where I'm based, gives examples of some of the tools that you might want to use, but we've included a couple as resources in the pack that might be helpful. So that's the Short Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which is the one that's on the screen there. There's other ones that are in there too, so have a look. That's very much a whistle-stop tour about how to monitor interventions, but there's loads of information there that is helpful. Okay, so in terms of what's there and the approach, I've taken you through that. I realise I've gone through a lot and a bit of a whistle-stop tour of it, and I've talked quite a long time. Just to flag at this point that you're not on your own with any of this. There is further support available. I know many schools have already signed up for a one-to-one school consultation. That'll be with me or some of my colleagues. And this is just a quick overview of what to expect from that. But that's an opportunity to go through with somebody what are the headlines from the report, thinking about what the priorities might need to be, thinking about gaps in provision and possible responses. But also, we're in the process of developing a resource that looks at what the evidence base is to support with evidence-informed responses. So those of you that have got one-to-one consultations in the next, we're starting them next week. We'll probably be working from a draft of that. We're finalising it as we go, and that'll be a resource that we'll share within those sessions, but also more widely once it's ready, which is looking at what evidence says, and then thinking about opportunities potentially for working with other schools, which takes me to my next slide. Another element of support is we will be facilitating what we're calling targeted learning sets, and that's bringing schools together that have got similar priorities or facing similar challenges, similar tricky issues, and supporting them to work together in some collaborative problem solving. And what we will do is facilitate those. And then we will ensure that that learning is disseminated across Be Well and more widely. And so an opportunity there to work with others and to think about what could help. If you want to be involved in those, basically suggest an area. If there's something you're stuck with, let us know and we will see if we can convene a targeted learning set. Even drop some ideas in the chat now, which Amy can pick up. Also, if you've got one-to-one consultation booked in, then bring it up with your consultant that you meet with them. We'll also be in the regular Be Well newsletters. We'll be letting you know some of the learning sets that we'll have established, and that's an invitation really to join. If you're interested, join. If you've got a suggestion for one, then let us know and we will be able to facilitate.